Reinhard Van Astrea, the Sword Saint, the strongest character within the world of ReZero. Reinhard is a character who, in the same way as Subaru, manages to exist as a complete and utter anomaly in the world of ReZero. Nothing notable about Reinhard can be replicated, be it his strength or his character. However, when people look at him, they usually have a few thoughts, which I'm sure the author has predicted, seeing as he has intricately interwoven this into his character. The first being, hey, isn't that guy the strongest in the series? They don't really see who Reinhard is, rather they just see him as a figurehead they can place at the top of their Discord debate tier list, so they can rank him high and debate with him on whether or not he would beat Goku or not. They don't actually see him as a character, they don't see him as somebody who's they like and seeing on screen, rather they just see him as someone they like watching fight, if you get what I mean. The second being, why does he even exist? He's just a walking cheat code and a boring character. And the third being a mixture between the two, whether it be representing and respecting his strength throughout all of the communities within anime there are, or also expressing disdain towards him because they feel as if him being in the series takes away all the stakes, right? I'm not sure people would have this sort of opinion if Reinhard was a villain. However, again, it just seems as if people have this weird stigma where they think you can be the actual strongest in the series while being a hero. I don't really get the point, but to explain further, to some people, Reinhard is what they wanted Subaru to be, completely strong with perfect moral character, who is not only acknowledged universally for his strength, but is also able to do whatever he wants whenever he wants, at least from their point of view. However, to view Reinhard as such a simple one-dimensional character would quite frankly be spitting on everything that Tappe, the author of ReZero, has worked for, and everything he has thought about whenever he has intricately written Reinhard's character. So today, I'll be trying to dispel any rumors and any doubts you have about Reinhard's character, and hopefully we'll be able to shed more light about who Reinhard is, what his character is about, what his character is based around, and hopefully people can gain a new insight on the character who is Reinhard Van Astrea. If you like this type of videos, please remember to like and subscribe, and let's get into the video. From a young age, members of the Astrea family are pushed towards inheriting the title of the Sword Saint, who along with the divine dragon Volcanica represents a key figure in morale for the entire kingdom. The Sword Saint is used as a title not only to represent one of the strongest knights in the kingdom, usually the strongest knight, but also to represent someone who has been blessed by the sword god Astrea, who is famed as one of the 3 heroes who are responsible with sealing Satella. The reason such a title is so important is usually individuals do not get a choice in whether or not they become the Sword Saint. Theresia, who's the previous Sword Saint before Reinhard, received it before her brothers despite the fact that she trained far less than them, while having a less combat-oriented personality. In totality, the title of the Sword Saint ripped away any chance of Theresia having a gentle life, something she always dreamed of. This plot point is further enhanced when she asks Will who wield the sword and when she didn't, to which he answers himself. The reason this is relevant to Reinhard and his character is because of a few specific reasons. While the tale of Theresia and how she came to love her shows you that you can rely on those around her, especially those stronger than you. This simply just isn't true for Reinhard. He represents the lonely pinnacle of the world, one where he is forced to uphold the title, which he comes to regret attaining very early on in his life, and to make sure that none of the other people around him have to suffer the same burden that he does. To make it worse, he lacks the opportunity to figuratively hand his sword over to anyone, seeing as he has no rivals. Nobody in the series even comes close to Reinhard in terms of strength. This perspective on Reinhard and the Sword Saint title and the meaning of this title is something that Reinhard himself initially disagreed with. At a young age, under the tutelage of his father and Wilhelm, Reinhard always wanted to become a hero, to become a beacon of hope to those around him, and save as many people as possible. However, at the age of 8 years old, due to his own childish wish of becoming the Sword Saint, Reinhard takes the divine protection of the Sword Saint from his mother, which eventually leads to her death against the leader of the witch cult, Pandora. A few interesting things to note about this is that Reinhard and Subaru are alike in the fact that they both blame themselves for things they have no control over. Subaru, for example, as stated by Typhon, sees himself as a villain even though he's truly done nothing wrong. And he blames himself, diving into a deep pit of self-hatred, which eventually leads to his fight against Julius, his outburst at the Capitol, as well as his argument with Emilia, which eventually ends up with them separating. In the same sense, Reinhard views his desire to become the Sword Saint not as a childish wish, which is simply granted due to the fact that the world itself is in love with him, but rather, he chooses to interpret his actions as ones done out of malice, maliciously taking the life of his grandmother, thus becoming a murderer. This idea goes as far as Arc 5, where in his confrontation with Theresia in the form of a corpse soldier, Reinhard claims that he murdered her, despite him having no real involvement in her death. This already goes to show that Reinhard isn't a morally perfect character, nor is he a character with no flaws at all. Rather, he's a character who can sympathize deeply with Subaru in the sense that both of them have immense issues with their own self-esteem, and Reinhard himself doesn't even believe he's worthy of the title of the Swordsay. And even when he gains the right to fulfill the prophecy that the Astrea family has written out for him, thus becoming the Swordsay, instead of seeing himself as the Swordsay, one of the greatest knights, in fact, the greatest knight in the entire kingdom, he sees himself as a complete murdering fraud who could only take the title forcefully rather than earning it as he believed his grandmother did. This childish idealization of his elders is one that Reinhard never gained the opportunity to grow out of, as immediately upon him rising to the title of the Swordsay, Reinhard is shunned by Wilhelm, not only calling him a man who murdered his wife, but also a monster. The title of a monster, something that completely strips you of your humanity and instead labels you a mindless beast, or worse, an overly powerful cog in the machine. That was a title given to him by his own grandfather, Wilhelm. We see Reinhard adopts these ideologies which were forced onto him at a young age through his introduction whenever he's about to begin a fight. For example, whenever Elsa praises him for being the Swordsay, Reinhard immediately comments he's anxious he will be unable to meet her expectations, and in every single instance in which he calls out his name before he begins a fight, he always begins with this, from the line of Master Swordsman, Reinhard Van Astrea. Instead of earning the title and holding it with pride like the Swordsay should, Reinhard flees from these expectations as he already views himself as a failure. The very fact that upon gaining the title, the two people who he wished to hold closest in his life after the death of his grandmother, Wilhelm and Heinkel, they immediately shun him, with Wilhelm going as far as abandoning the Astrea name, simply to never reunite with Reinhard again. That instance alone in Reinhard's mind was enough to qualify him as a failure. After all, what would be the use of a Swordsay who couldn't even protect his own family? As the series develops, we get to see more evidence that his overwhelming strength, rather than serving as an anchor, allowing him to rely on others and vice versa, actually creates him as a symbol of fear. Within the EX side stories of ReZero, which take place before the main story, we see Reinhard has a collar of submission placed around his neck, due to fear that he will betray the kingdom, even despite the fact that they know the collar is utterly ineffective. More laws are even introduced, such as the Reinhard law, which prohibit him from entering foreign countries. These laws and rules, particularly the Reinhard law, serve to drive this narrative isolation further. Unable to make genuine connections in Lugunica, where he is praised and feared for his strength, which he doesn't even believe he deserves, Reinhard has nowhere to run. He's simply a presence with too much strength to seek guidance from other countries, as they too fear his strength and the threat he possesses just by entry. Each interaction he has with people, though polite, has a noticeable distance that is present within each interaction. They don't simply enjoy his presence, nor do they actually care about how he is doing or what he enjoys. Instead, he's simply Reinhard, simply the strongest, simply the Swordsay. However, this isn't the sort of shell that Reinhard lives in his entire life. As the series progresses, we see his interactions with Fel properly allow him to grow as a character and become a human being who can make connections with others. In fact, Tappe goes out of his way to tell us that Reinhard considers Felt his best friend despite her rude nature towards him. And the reason for this is simple. When he interacts with Felt, she doesn't wear the mask that nobles wear, nor does she see him as invincible. Although she acknowledges and respects his strength, she constantly worries for him, even making plans in the situation in which he fails. Although these sorts of plans are largely useless due to his low failure rate, the mere fact that someone considers him a fallible human rather than an infallible monster is something that Reinhard can deeply appreciate. Additionally, this point is also touched on in Arc 5, where Subaru lets Reinhard know that he intends to fill in wherever Reinhard is lacking. This care to be able to see that sometimes he is not able to solve things on his own, that he isn't able to solve every single problem like superglue on a freshly cracked wall, rather he's treated as a human being. When Reinhard temporarily dies to regulars, Subaru doesn't shout out in anger because he lost a tool, rather it's because he thought he lost a deep friend. The lonely isolation of being the strongest, isolating him from any forms of recognition, forcing him to call himself a monster who hunts monsters. That is the identity that Reinhard has been forced into. And with the fact that none of the members of ReZero, barring a few, and even the people who watch the show, are unable to see him as anything beyond his strength, anything beyond the Swordsay, shows this fully. Reinhard's self-hatred and internal insecurity reach a boiling point in his fight against Aricia. During it, he shows little to no emotion as he cuts down the body of his own grandmother in a single swing. When he sees the body of his grandmother moving, he rejects it, causing him to put up a facade that he's emotionally detached from the situation. However, we can tell visibly as well as through his words that he is actually deeply shaken by the matter. To Reinhard, the person he is fighting currently represents his biggest failure, his biggest injustice being thrown in his face once more, and as such, he chooses to do what he believes to be living up to his name as a monster through cutting down his grandmother, despite the fact that this was the ethical and rational thing to do, and he even goes as far as saying it himself.
死者は動かない。死者にその先はない。僕はその不条理を許さない。
In his own words, he will not allow the absurdity that there could be another who played a factor in his grandmother's demise to exist, even though it is obviously the witch cult who caused the demise. And because he does not want this absurdity to exist, he spares no emotions nor tears in cutting her down, as he believes that is what a monster should do. And in one moment where Wilhelm has the chance to make amends, instead of speaking to his grandson kindly and allowing him the opportunity to express his feelings, he chooses to refer to him once more in the oppressive and restrictive manner, giving him the title of the Swordsayer, referring to him formally, finally showing the unbridgeable gap that exists between the three members of the Astrea family. All in all, I think Reinhard's character does very well in representing themes like isolation, strength, as well as justice. Despite the world giving him perfect motives to become a villain, the isolation, the oppression that society forces onto him, and even the suppression that he causes onto his own self, suppressing his own identity and giving himself the title of a monster. And the people around him also give him this title, calling him monstrous, something that he himself takes offense to, yet he puts up a facade of a smile. Despite all of this, Reinhard remains loyal and continues to fight for what's right. But that's about it for what I have to say about Reinhard. If you like these type of videos, please remember to like and subscribe. This has been Shinra, and I'm out.